So, a bunch of slaves. I've decided to take some time off to record a new video. I'm not sure how long it's gonna last. Essentially, it's due to a tweet that appeared on my Twitter feed shared by another content creator. He began talking about the very same topic I've been discussing for quite some time now. That's why it's been talked about on my channel that eventually the label will lose its significance. The label of the man like this who wants to be independent, who wants to be a confirmed bachelor, won't mean anything because there will be so many men already following the lifestyle. That it won't make much difference. But the topic I want to discuss in this video, at least the initial one, is the following. It's something I've talked about several times on my channel, which delves into the gradual decline in the number of men willing to take on the role of providers, whether directly or indirectly. By direct provider, I mean a man who financially supports his girlfriend or wife, whereas an indirect provider refers to a man who contributes to the support of other women through state mechanisms, such as taxes. The reason behind the anticipated rise in the number of men who will resist this role is quite evident and becoming increasingly significant. We might not observe it as prominently in older generations like the boomers, men in their 50s and 60s, as their era had a distinct job market, economic conditions, and gender role dynamics. Many became providers without needing to make significant sacrifices. There remained a market reserve in labor and academia for these men, enabling them to support women and turn them into housewives. However, in the minds of these boomers, these older gentlemen, they believe that the younger men, those from the generations that followed them, must do the same as they did. They think that if they do not, they are not considered real men. In other words, analyzing and interpreting the entire context from an external perspective is deemed irrelevant. Quite simply, if they were providers, then the younger men also must be providers. That's why we often say the boomer era must end. It seems that until it does, the emancipation of women won't occur, as Platinio often mentions. What began in the 20th century and continues is women's empowerment. The West is essentially in this campaign of the desire to implement as many laws and allocate as many resources as possible to empower women in an effort to help them somehow attain the same level as men. We can observe that since the 60s and 70s, up to the present day, this has not been achieved. The feminist movement continually voices numerous complaints about the existence of men who still hold positions above them, because it is known that it's a narrow perspective focusing solely on the men at the top, while the rest remain unseen. We can't discuss the number of homeless men or those in prison or jobless. It's irrelevant. It only notices men above it, and there will always be men above it. So feminism is an endless crusade. We'll always be complaining about it. Additionally, there's another topic that requires discussion, and perhaps I'll delve into it further in this video. It's also an issue that I've observed being addressed by other authors and content creators. Platino put it quite aptly. I have previously described it as the notion that the sole way for a man to retain a woman is if she relies on him either physically or financially. Platino elaborated on this by saying, "For women to remain with men, or for men to successfully attract women, they must have something of value to offer them. Wouldn't you agree? This concept might apply primarily to serious relationships, but it is more accurately aimed at fostering marriage, raising children, establishing a legacy, and so forth. Therefore, it's essential for men to present something valuable to women. When a society embarks on a mission to empower women, with feminism being substantially supported by public funds, consider this, if you were to remove public funding, feminism would likely cease to exist, correct? It's the public funding and the influence of the written word. By empowering women, you inadvertently weaken the institution of marriage and reduce the birth rate, because it leads to a situation where women find themselves independent of men, and they might need it indirectly, keeping an illusion of independence as they get extra rights from the state. Then there's sexual dependency, the whoring, the cycle of promiscuity, right? Normalizing cheating, open relationships, and so forth. But anyway, the essential point is that we are seeing men from the younger generations who are more and more resisting what are known as feminist rights, or as some might say, feminist privileges. Let's be clear about what it is. Consequently, we are witnessing a sort of ongoing feud between younger generation men and their older counterparts. It is quite similar to the kind of feud that also happens between women of the older generation and those of the younger generation. Specifically, women under and over 30. Women under 30 enjoy life and don't focus on morality, moralism, serious relationships, or virtue. Only after 30 do women seek something more serious. Because she wants security, she's no longer getting the security she used to get from her parents or from her educational institution or from the company where she worked, and that's also another issue. Women are seeing that they're getting older and they no longer have the same ability to attract men, and a new crop of younger women is arriving. So this conflict between generations isn't just something that exists between men, it's also something that exists between women. So much so that another thing that I'm going to nevenize a little in this video too is the question regarding the significant impact that sexual liberation had, a topic which I believe Platino also explored in his videos. Even in that quick live session with me, Nilma and Platino, I joined in from the inside just to discuss it, because sexual liberation during the second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s was indeed a substantial blow. It was genuinely a significant scam orchestrated by older men who possessed greater status and resources. These men targeted younger men, and this deception eventually contributed to what is known as the 80-20 rule. You see, the old men who had resources and status after sexual liberation could very well arrive at a moment when, or he's cheating on his wife because his wife is older, less attractive, and then either because his wife asks for a divorce or he himself asks for a divorce, he simply gains that freedom of being able to pick up younger women who should be in relationships with men from younger generations, right? So for these folks, it's just like a buffet. And as mentioned, having more resources doesn't change much. Many older men in the 50s, 60s, 70s have had 2, 3 wives and countless children. So that's another aspect to consider. I'm straying a bit here. I intended to focus on the issue of provision and independence, but it's hard not to factor in the sexual context. The other consequence was the one that remains active today, known as the 80-20 rule, which can also evolve into the 90-10 rule. This situation in business might be deteriorating further, reaching this level due to female empowerment. As I've mentioned before, for a woman to feel attracted to a man she must admire him, she needs to see him as being superior to her. By empowering women, you are merely raising their expectations even higher. You're pulling them more and more towards the men at the top. So one thing that happens not just here in Brazil, but in other countries too, in a very large volume of occurrences, is the issue, for example, of alpha widows, right? A woman who, when she was young, beautiful and fertile, was in a relationship. I'm not going to talk about whether the guy is lame, I don't know what, it doesn't matter. It's simply that the guy is more attractive. It might be due to status, resources, or just genetics. And neither the man nor the woman wants to commit, right? This can result in many single mothers. Single mothers or individuals who divorce without having been married for perhaps 5 or 6 years. So a consequence of this isn't just that older men date younger women, leaving younger men at a disadvantage. There's also the other issue of a lot of single moms starting to appear, or stranded or left by a widow. Therefore, for men at the lower levels, there are only the leftovers available. In a sense, everyone is a cock. Everyone is a cock in 2 different senses. I have another audio to release discussing this, but every man who isn't presently at the top is a cock in the first sense, because when he seeks a woman for a serious relationship, if that's his desire, he'll find himself having to settle for other men's leftovers. The second reason relates to cookie situation, which is due to our feminist welfare state. This means that in addition to supporting himself and the woman or women he's directly involved with, he's also indirectly supporting all other women through the welfare system. This point is closely connected to the tweet we mentioned. However, there is yet another aspect to consider, so let's proceed to discuss that now. I've already explained why older men more readily accept these feminist rights and privileges. They had greater resources and status, allowing them to be generous. In contrast, a woman with more resources and status tends to be more demanding, not more generous. I've previously talked about this topic, I believe it was during the first live session I had with Hernani, where I explained this concept in detail. In a society where men are given the power and resources, you'll notice that the number of marriages tends to rise, and similarly, the birth rate also tends to go up. This is because, for a man, when he possesses sufficient resources, especially considering his instinctual nature, it is entirely natural for him to take on the role of a provider. If he has additional resources available, he will likely choose to have even more children. For him, it's a matter of personal pride. And it's that particular feeling, when you follow your natural instincts, you tend to become even happier. Regarding women, in every scenario, in every nation where women are empowered, what is the common outcome? The number of marriages decreases and the birth rate declines. Why does this happen? A woman will only remain with a man if he has something valuable to offer her. If he has nothing to offer, he simply doesn't care. A man is capable of loving a woman regardless of whether she provides anything for him. Even his instinct compels him to want to take care of her. A woman, however, isn't capable of loving a guy who is dependent on her. You can look up the history of this on the internet. There are countless examples of guys who have had their asses kicked because they were sacked, and so on. Women also have two significant issues. Apart from the fact that she is solely attracted to and exclusively desires a relationship with a man she holds in high regard, who must be superior to her, there is also a provisional and utilitarian aspect to consider. For her to remain with this man, he must fulfill his role. This can involve partial provision or total provision. The specifics are irrelevant. So progressing a bit further, we observe this division among the generations. And this younger generation of men, essentially, when you examine it, there's not just a matter of them having grown up alongside many women who were empowered, who studied alongside them, who worked with them, who competed with them for employment opportunities. Therefore, initially, they already possessed that conditioning towards egalitarianism. Right? Many men today weren't raised with the expectation of being providers. Therefore, you can't expect them to be as generous as those from past generations. Right? Not only were they not taught to be providers, but they also grew up viewing women as equals. And they too, even if they wish to be providers, find themselves unable to afford it. We can examine the shift in the tax burden over the years, and we can also consider the expense associated with this empowerment, the financial impact of these families. So today's men, especially the younger ones, have many reasons not to be generous or want to be providers. I'm focusing on their personal lives. Right? Now, let's consider the bigger picture. The macro involves feminist laws and privileges. Why would men accept that, right? When they hear about women being independent, but is that the illusion of independence? However, another important detail to consider is this. We must also thoroughly examine the variations in the proportion of single men and women across different generations. You see, there's this question about older generation men. They have more resources and greater status. However, there's another aspect to consider. If a significant proportion of men in a particular generation are married, then single adults become a minority, a very small minority, as was the case until just a few decades ago. Additionally, people are choosing to get married at a younger age, aren't they? They are tying the knot before reaching the age of 30, which isn't the main concern at present. Consequently, it becomes simpler for the government and the feminist movement to aggressively promote feminist rights and privileges to the public. You see, when most men in society from the current generation are married, have spouses, and have children, does it indeed make it more acceptable for these men to embrace feminist rights? Because it will benefit his wife, then as a result, it will benefit him as well. Even though he might be unaware of this empowerment issue where his wife's increasing independence could make their relationship more vulnerable, posing risks like betrayal or divorce, he will still view it positively. He might say, oh, we have maternity leave in our country, which is excellent because it means my wife will receive that benefit to take care of our children. For instance, you might consider the situation where women have the opportunity to retire earlier. This is beneficial because when I age, my wife will retire sooner than I do, allowing her to care for the home and myself, correct? She'll have the chance to organize everything so that we can enjoy our later years together. Thus, there is a broader context to consider. When you relate this to the current generation, does it not apply? I recall there was even a video, though I can't quite remember the details. It was featured on some CNN program, probably a few years back. It was simply yet another case of women stepping forward to advocate for an increasing number of feminist rights and privileges. I believe it was connected to the Obamacare matter, specifically regarding health insurance, aiming to make it more affordable for women. This woman, appearing on CNN, was offering a rather feeble and hypocritical justification, which went as follows. When you provide benefits to women, you are in fact also providing benefits to men. That's the disdain for the West, isn't it? The general belief in the West is that empowering women is the ultimate solution to all problems, whether it's ecology, the economy, global growth, and so forth. They disregard logic, ignore statistics, and dismiss facts. However, she was still using the argument that when you empower women, You're benefiting the man because then the men will notice that their wives are gaining advantages. However, what this woman neglected to mention is precisely what I've just highlighted, which includes the proportion of single adults, the proportion of women who are divorced, as well as the proportion of women who either don't have children or are single mothers, among other scenarios. So, the first detail I've already mentioned is that if today's man no longer possesses the same level of resources and status that he once did, and if we are already facing a higher tax burden, this man also finds himself without a partner, without a wife, without children, and without a legacy, then why would he be willing to tolerate increasingly more feminist laws and privileges? As I previously stated, this is dependent on public funding. And if you delve deeper into this matter, you'll notice that the majority of those who pay income tax are indeed men. Perhaps it's women who are the largest contributors, right? Or maybe it's even more nuanced than that, considering the issue of alimony and the fact that women generally have custody of the children, isn't it? However, when you consider the main portion of the income tax, it's the men who are primarily sustaining the business. As I mentioned, if they lack partners or children and are already living a single lifestyle, why should they endure it? I've predicted this in videos since the channel's inception, saying this dissatisfaction among men will increase. It's simply natural. Just as a woman starts seeking something more serious, I'm not referring to when she's younger. A woman, when she's only engaging in sex with a man and he doesn't interact with her in other ways, doesn't converse with her, she often feels taken advantage of. Similarly, when a man is supplying utility and resources to women, particularly when it's through the state, benefiting all women collectively, and he isn't gaining a mate or a chance for reproduction, he will likely feel exploited. When someone feels exploited, it is entirely predictable that they might revolt. Furthermore, we can delve into the topic of independent women a bit further. There are a lot of women pretending to be independent, pretending to be right-wing. This reminds me of that video I made of just the tweets from the women there when I can't remember which politician it was, but it's some politician from Brasilia saying that the retirement age for men and women should be equalized. And then there were a lot of women with Twitter accounts with flags of Brazil, Israel, Bolsonaro, I don't know what, right? All the right-wing patriotic women were emphatically insisting that no, this was nonsensical, that women are expected to work double, triple, and even quadruple shifts. This is precisely what I am referring to when I mention that. Today's modern woman harbors the illusion of independence. She perceives herself as independent because she benefits from early retirement. She feels independent due to maternity leave, welfare support, and preferential treatment that she receives. We are already witnessing the emergence of a 50-50 planet, where not only in the public sector but also in the private sector, affirmative action and quotas will be implemented specifically for women. Indeed. Is that initial stroke of the pen in the 60s and 70s, which mandates equal pay for men and women, truly sufficient? Because it is something you cannot quantify. I believe it should be independent of gender and independent of all factors. There does not need to be identical salaries for everyone. Every employee must negotiate with their boss, and each individual should be rewarded based on their productivity. However, that's a different issue altogether. Ultimately, women, especially modern women, live under an illusion of independence. Regardless of whether one leans left or right politically, it makes no difference. Whenever there's a discussion about their privileges, they tend to become defensive, right? You can't just take away my illusion of independence. Isn't that right? They're the ones who are dependently independent. So much so, in fact, that you can actually observe another issue there. Consider all the empowerment that women have gained over the past few decades. And notice how many women have relinquished feminist rights when they find themselves in family court. The sheer number of divorces and the extent of benefits they demand during divorce proceedings serve as evidence that women, in reality, don't desire to be independent. They have a desire to be dependent. It's hard to fault them for this because it's instinctual. This behavior is essentially the role they have played throughout human evolution. One cannot even argue that hypergamy is incorrect. No. Hypergamy is a natural occurrence. A woman must prioritize her own well-being and that of her children. The issue arises when society constructs an entire collective and social system where every man is expected to provide for every woman. without any guarantee of finding a partner, without any assurance of leaving a legacy or having children. It is to such an extent that we can observe the absurdities in certain countries where DNA testing is prohibited, or in places where paternity fraud carries no consequences or punishment. This notion, this illusion of independence and the collective reliance on women are only going to worsen. It's going to worsen because, as I've said, it's the gap between an empowered man and woman. The correct approach would be for women to gain emancipation, as Platinio discusses on his channel. Essentially, you remove all additional rights and privileges and begin implementing laws to ensure men and women are treated equally. Why do I suggest that this would be the ideal path forward? Why do I propose that this would be the most beneficial outcome? Because here's the thing, it would indeed be a fair and balanced system, equally beneficial for both men and women. And you simply can't say, oh my god, that would cause harm to women. It is designed to be equitable for everyone involved. No, why is that? In my view, only a small fraction of women, perhaps just 20%, truly desire and know how to be independent. The vast majority, around 80%, prefer to be reliant on others. They would have the opportunity to receive education and to work. And if they wish to compete with men, then let them do so. There's no issue with that. However, the notion of emancipating women and removing feminist rights would be effective due to what? Exactly. Due to the points already covered in this video. For a woman to establish a relationship with the man, to marry him and have children, she must find herself in need of a man. Each time a feminist right or privilege is created through the state, it provides women with reasons not to rely on men. If women find they do not need men, what are the consequences? Marriage begins to crumble and the birth rate declines. The number of divorced and unmarried women is on the rise. All of these factors are interconnected. I believe the situation will worsen for the following reasons. Firstly, due to the issue of empowerment. As I mentioned, there is a significant amount of support provided through welfare, which gives women reasons to not engage with men. Additionally, the empowerment question arises where women gain resources and status, leading them to pursue men who are at the top. And the masses of men are going to start getting more and more angry about feminist rights and feminist privileges. And as I've already said, empowered men, more marriage, more families. Empowered women, less marriage and fewer families. In the end, I'm unsure if women's emancipation will occur. For it to happen, boomers had to end. Also, 80% of women want to be dependent. There is only a minority, perhaps around 20% of women who genuinely desire emancipation. Therefore, I'm uncertain if this will truly occur. The momentum for this change is already in motion. Among the majority of men, there is a reluctance to continue being providers, whether directly or indirectly through the state. This shift is already underway. Furthermore, on the male side, there exists a majority who support the emancipation of women. As I've mentioned before, if women are emancipated, what then occurs? The majority of women, the 80% who are independent, will end up submitting to a husband or boyfriend and obeying him. And then we're back to having a supposedly traditional family, a kind of patriarchal thing, and the other 20% will be independent. That's fine. But the point is that on the female side, you see that there's no point in labeling. There's no point in labels. There's no point in left-wing, right-wing, or party politics. It makes no difference, as I mentioned. Many women on Twitter, claiming to be right-wing, oppose equalizing the retirement age for men and women. That's why I use the 80% ratio. Surveys in other countries show the same result. People still don't get it when criticized. Why not live as a confirmed bachelor and stop complaining? Due to the reasons I just mentioned, people still haven't grasped the idea that men today, particularly those of the second generation, the upcoming generation, won't be given the choice to distance themselves from women, to simply step away from women and not be responsible for supporting them. This choice will not be available, and in fact, every effort will be made to remove this option from men. Because of the reasons I just stated, the problem is that you have a growing number of men in the male population who don't want to provide, who want to be independent, who want to look after themselves. However, on the female side, we find a significant majority, at least 80% of women who are dependent. For all intents and purposes, they are reliant and actually desire to be so. You only have, at most, 20% who are truly capable of independence. Thus, the woman who can be independent is indifferent to feminist rights. She doesn't concern herself with privileges. In any event, she finds she doesn't require it. It doesn't really matter whether she gained her status and resources through her own hard work and achievements, or if she inherited them from her family or elsewhere. The crucial point is that when a woman possesses status and resources, she is less likely to be overly concerned about the feminist right. This is quite natural, as it boils down to a matter of necessity and incentives involved. However, the main point is regarding these 80% of women who are dependent, and while I can't specify the exact source at this moment, it was something I came across online, likely during one of those debates by men's rights groups. People need to grasp this. That's why men can't just walk away and ignore women to live as they wish. Men will always need to provide directly through relationships or indirectly via the state. This is due to the following. In that remark, the woman was making a huge statement. Exactly what is expected of her, being part of the 80% who are dependent. She was expressing that if men are unwilling to take care of women, to support women, particularly in the roles of boyfriends and husbands, then it becomes necessary for the state to intervene and assume the responsibilities that men are neglecting. Reflect on what I've just stated. For this majority, 80% of women are reliant effectively on welfare, quotas, affirmative action, feminist rights, feminist privileges, or share of property, a pension, alimony, and so forth. For all intents and purposes, they are either dependent, partially dependent, or completely dependent. For this group, in their minds, merely the fact that they were born a woman is already enough of a justification that someone must care for them, someone must provide for them, and someone must be of use to them. It's essentially considered a birthright. That's what the woman expressed in her comment, in the very comment I am quoting. If a man won't care for a woman, we can see this, for instance, in the misanthropic bubble, where there's a crisis of abandoned women. Like the video I mentioned, there might just be a stranded woman's purse later on. Even the UN is starting to suggest that women unable to find a husband and have children are considered to have a disability and society should support them. That's precisely why I assert that a man won't have the luxury of turning his back on a woman, even if he's not gaining any benefits, lacks a wife, or doesn't have children. If he's not prepared to engage with a woman directly, whether as a boyfriend or as a husband to provide for her and care for her, it will be imposed by force through the state. This is why I mentioned it will deteriorate further, because this dependent mass has already come to understand that feminism has, in a way, worked against their interests. They are already able to observe, for instance, that their mother or grandmother experienced a life that was significantly more comfortable and pleasant, and much healthier for all intents and purposes, and happier, because she had the option of working, the option of studying, and she also had a husband who provided for her. And then when it finally comes to the turn of the curve, generation of women who, as I said, want to be dependent, for better or worse, or dependent on a partner, or dependent on the state, which is the same, because the state's money is men's money. But anyway, she realizes that now it's her turn, and she practically has the obligation to work, the obligation to study, because no one is willing to look after them. And they notice that they lack a provider, someone or a partner to care for them. Then, as I mentioned, they will begin to insist that the state assumes this responsibility. Therefore, you can observe the perfect storm here, which is why I mentioned that the situation is likely to deteriorate further. Because if in the past, when there were more generous men willing to be providers, women already complained and demanded feminist privileges, just imagine how much worse this situation is likely to become now. Nowadays, you have a significant number of men from the current generation who do not wish to be providers or, at most, desire to have an equal relationship with women. Yet, you still have a large group of women who remain dependent. That if you find yourself unable to secure the deal through the man, you will begin to insist on obtaining the deal through the state. I've discussed this topic several times before, the issue concerning micro and macro dynamics. The relationship dynamic you find in the micro, which is the individual personal relationship, mirrors the dynamic present in the macro. To illustrate, in a typical relationship, regardless of how much effort you put into maintaining equality with the woman, you both end up paying your own bills. It's unavoidable, isn't it? It's inherent in the female instinct that after some time, I would say at least a couple of years, the woman will begin to insist that you become a provider for her, that you ensure a more comfortable life for her, and that you take on a utilitarian role. This is because in her perspective, being born a woman and being in a relationship with you means that it is your role. Essentially, she believes she deserves that. So, if you have this dynamic in the micro, you can be sure that in the macro, in the government sphere, you also have the same dynamic, right? No matter how much women embrace this illusion of independence, no matter how much they discuss or how empowered they feel, how independent they claim to be, and how much they insist they don't need men, the truth remains that ultimately they do. Not only do they require them, but women actually need men significantly more than men need women. Right, and I believe that one of my most crucial roles is to raise awareness among men about this reality. It is only when men become fully aware of this reality that they can begin to learn how to say no. If they acquire the ability to say no, then there is a possibility to change the situation. Furthermore, it is essential for men to understand that learning to say no is a skill they need to develop. From my perspective, it's going to become ever more essential because we must bear in mind the following. During the most recent election, the representation of women in Congress saw a significant rise, increasing by 50%. Moreover, I've come across various news reports indicating that the quantity of legislative proposals concerning women's rights has reached an unprecedented level in Brazil. So you see, like I said, it's a perfect storm because men don't want to be providers anymore. They want to have a relationship of equals, or they don't want to have a relationship at all. And congratulations, is that what feminism preached? What they hoped would happen, right? The people in the feminist movement. But also, on the other hand, see how real what I'm talking about is. The more you empower women, the more you make them demanding. Never before in the history of humanity has a class of women been as privileged and benefited as Western women are today. And then you see what I mean. The more empowered they become, the higher their expectations grow. They are practically never satisfied. So right now, for example, here in Brazil, the most empowered woman there has ever been is from the current generation. And it is women who are the ones demanding the most feminist rights and privileges. She is the one who demands the most benefits. It is both sad and amusing simultaneously, yet it is something that everyone must learn. Independent women, those who are truly capable of being independent and have a desire to be independent, constitute a minority within a minority. The vast majority of them are dependent, they wish to be dependent, and this is entirely expected as this has been the role that women have traditionally played in the evolutionary game. The man traditionally provides, while the woman is often dependent and they come together, have children. And so the story of humanity continues. However, as I mentioned, for things to evolve, men will need to learn the art of negotiation, and most importantly, they must learn to say no. We shall see what unfolds from this point forward, but observing this storm has certainly been interesting.